I'm sure that you have said to someone, "Please pray for me," or someone has said to you, "Won't you pray for me?" And this is a way in which we connect with each other in difficult times. We ask for support, we ask for prayers, we ask that someone would have our back and knock at the doorway of God, asking for a healing, for instance, or for success in surgery, asking that we pray for something that we're going through, a difficult time, or even pray for a newly married couple that they will maintain and honor their vows, or pray as often as I've asked for prayers for this shrine to shine on for 25 years. We ask each other that. Pray for me. And certainly we hear Jesus giving a parable today, and one way of reading the parable is we have to keep on praying for each other and knocking at the doorway of God, because sometimes God doesn't listen like that unjust judge, and we have to be persistent in prayer, because finally, after being persistent, God will give us our heart's desires. And certainly the greatest prayer that we pray is, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done," or, "Father, not as I will, but as thy will be done." And so when you ask, "Pray for me," what we're really doing is what the people of Moses' time was doing when they held up his hands. We need each other to hold us up, especially when things are not going as well as we want, or when we feel weak. When we say, "Pray for me," basically what we're asking for is, pray with me and hold up my arms and hold up my heart so that I'm not all alone in this situation. And that's a typical read of this parable that we just heard. You know, we have to keep knocking and keep being insistent like that widow who was probably Sicilian. Just keep on doing this and asking and asking and asking. And that's a way of reading this parable. But you know, there are two sides to every story. You've heard that too. There's another way of reading this parable that Jesus gives. And that is that the widow who keeps knocking and knocking and asking for justice, maybe that's God. And maybe the unjust judge is us. We have hardened our hearts. We don't want to be bothered by anybody. We don't want to change the way we've been or the way we will be. We want to just sit on our thrones, being the center of our own universes, and thinking we got it all together, and God keeps knocking, keeps insisting that something changes in us. That another way to read this is that it is God who keeps praying to us so that we might become a vessel whereby God can enter and God can transform us. Because we can get stubborn, hard-headed. We can get people who are resistant of any kind of transformation and love. We can get stuck in our ways, stuck in our attitudes, and then live unjust lives like that unjust judge. Because it seems to me that that's more apt an interpretation of this parable, that God is the one who keeps persisting at us until we finally let go, until we finally realize that we're only able to give up control, give up thinking that somehow we got it all made, and give up ourselves so that the God who keeps knocking persistently at us can transform us into Christ. Now, once when I was a young person, probably a little older than you, Andrew, but never as tall, I was walking on the beach up in New England, the Atlantic Ocean coast. And I saw a crab, one of these little crab creatures, walking on the shore. And a seagull came down and started attacking the crab. I had never seen anything like this before. And so picture me in my little bathing suit, appalled at this seagull, like that widow, keep knocking, and that seagull kept pounding at the shell of that crab. I was horrified watching this thing happen in front of my very eyes. Banging, banging, banging on the crab, and until finally it cracked the shell. And I said to myself, there's got to be a homily in this thing. Because in a real sense, I think that that's what the widow is doing, knocking and knocking. That's what God is doing to us who are encrusted by a hard shell of prejudice and fear, of egocentrism, encrusted by a hard shell like big old crabs. And God keeps knocking, banging, until finally, by gift of Spirit, by gift of grace, God can break through our hearts so that our hearts become the heart of Christ. And if you have any doubt that God's banging, just check your pulse. If you have any doubt that God's still knocking at our hearts, just put your hand on your heart. Because as long as we are alive, God is like that widow who knocks at our hearts and says, "Let me in," until finally our shells give up. Our shells give up. And we let God in. And God transforms us, takes us into Himself, creates of us a new human. God keeps knocking at our injustice. For I'm hard-pressed to believe that God is an unjust judge, which is the typical way of reading this psalm. That God is some ogre in heaven that you got to keep appeasing. So I like my translation and my interpretation better. That we're the unjust judges. And like that seagull, God keeps cracking us open until we die. Die to ourselves, die to our pride, die to our egos, die to our greed, die so that Christ can live in us. And so this is, for 25 years, what we have been doing together as a Shrine community. For 25 years, working with people who kept knocking at the door of Cardinal Bernardin to keep this place open and not sell it for condo property. And finally, like an unjust judge, that Cardinal Bernardin, who himself was Italian, but from the northern part of Italy, he gave in because they didn't give up praying. And for 25 years, we have been a place where I pray that God continues to knock at our hearts, persistently knocking, until this community of faith becomes a community of love. And that this community of love then goes out into the world, generous-hearted, to be for others the promise and the love of God who cries out for justice in a world of such pain and brokenness, a world of such broken dreams and broken hearts, that we become a community inspired by Our Lady to walk out of this place week after week differently, because God comes to us. And in the spirit of this Holy Communion, in thanks and praise that we receive again this morning, in this praise and thanksgiving sacrament of life, we come forward, and the persistent God insists on entering our hearts in the body and blood of Christ. Sooner or later, that crab had to give up. There was no hope. And if God is as persistent as the widow is in this story, stop holding on, God says to us. Sooner or later, God will enter. Why waste so much time resisting the inevitable? Let him in now.